In the forensics of American music, there is a specific kind of frequency that cannot be taught in conservatories. It is a sound born from the biological necessity of survival, a vibration that occurs only when a human soul is pushed to the absolute edge of its endurance. Etta James possessed this frequency. By the time she passed away in 2012, the world knew her as a monument of soul, a woman who could melt steel with a single, blues-drenched note. But the investigation into her origins reveals that the Queen of Soul was built from a foundation of ghosts and structural abandonment. The story begins on the 25th of January 1938 in the marginalized corners of Los Angeles. Jamesetta Hawkins was born to a 14-year-old girl named Dorothy Hawkins. Dorothy was a child herself, a victim of a society that offered no safety net for young, black, unwed mothers. In the cold data of social history, Jamesetta was a statistic, a fatherless child with a high yellow complexion and golden brown hair. These physical traits sparked a forensic obsession in Etta that would last a lifetime. Rumors whispered that her father was the legendary white pool shark, Rudolph Minnesota Fats Wanderone. Etta would spend decades chasing this ghost, seeking a DNA connection to a man who would never acknowledge her existence. This was the first wound, the absence of a father's name, leaving her with a void where an identity should have been. Dorothy Hawkins was a drifter, a woman of the streets who moved through the city like a shadow, disappearing for weeks at a time to chase her own demons. Consequently, Jamesetta was left in the care of foster parents, Lula and Jesse Rogers. It was here that the miracle of her voice was first documented, but it was a miracle forged in a crucible of cruelty. By the age of 5, she was the star of the street. Paul Baptist Church Choir. The congregation would fall into a hushed reverence when the tiny girl opened her mouth, but the training she received was anything but holy. Her choir director, Professor Hines, was a forensic student of vocal projection, but his methods were brutal. He would physically strike the child in the chest while she sang, forcing her to project from her diaphragm through the reflex of pain. "That's how I learned to sing like a grown woman," Etta would later recall. She wasn't singing hymns. She was shouting back at a world that was already trying to knock the wind out of her. The exploitation of her talent didn't stop at the church doors. Her foster father, Jesse, realized that the girl's voice was a commodity. He would wake Jamesetta in the middle of the night, dragging her into the living room to perform for his drunken friends. If she refused or showed exhaustion, she was punished. Here, the forensics of her trauma show the emergence of a defense mechanism. She learned that her voice was her only shield and her only currency. She was a child star in a world of predators, learning early on that applause often comes with a hidden cost. The final fracture of her childhood occurred at age 12 when Lula Rogers, the only stable maternal figure she had ever known, died of a stroke. The social structure collapsed around Jamesetta. She was returned to her biological mother, Dorothy, in San Francisco's Fillmore district. This was not a reunion of love, but a collision of two broken lives. Dorothy was still hustling, still unstable, and Etta was now a rebellious adolescent with a voice like a volcanic eruption. She stopped attending school and started running with street gangs. She found a sense of belonging in the friction of the streets, smoking, drinking, and fighting. The forensics of this period show a girl who was trying to thicken her skin to match the hardness of her environment. But even in the middle of this rebellion, the music remained her primary nervous system. She would sing on street corners and in illegal after-hours clubs, her voice already sounding like aged whiskey and heartbreak. She was a 14-year-old survivor who had been groomed by the church, exploited by her family, and abandoned by her father. She was a walking open wound, but she was about to meet a man named Johnny Otis who would help her turn that wound into a weapon. The little girl from Watts was gone. The fire of Etta James was about to ignite. The transition from a street-hardened teenager to a professional recording artist happened in a flash of forensic serendipity. By 1952, Etta was living in San Francisco, leading a vocal trio called the Creolettes. They were girls who sang with a rugged, rhythmic edge that mirrored the rough-and-tumble energy of the Fillmore district. When Johnny Otis, the legendary bandleader and R&B scout, caught their act, he didn't just hear talent, he heard a revolution. Otis was a man who understood the pocket of black music better than anyone, and in the 14-year-old Etta, he saw a fire that was impossible to extinguish. Otis moved Etta to Los Angeles and performed a forensic rebranding of her identity. He flipped her name from Jamesetta to Etta James and renamed her group The Peaches. But Etta was never meant to be part of a sugary ensemble. She was a soloist by biological design. Her first record, Roll With Me, Henry, was a raw, aggressive answer to Hank Ballard's Work With Me, Annie. The forensics of the song were scandalous for the early 1,950 seconds. It was saturated with a heavy, driving beat and lyrics that hummed with a primal, adult energy. Because the title was deemed too suggestive for the conservative airwaves of white America, it was renamed The Wallflower. Despite the censorship, the record was a seismic event in the underground black clubs. It hit #1 on the R&B charts in 1955, making Etta a teenage superstar. However, the investigation into her early finances reveals the first of many structural betrayals. While Etta's version was the authentic heartbeat of the streets, a white pop singer named Georgia Gibbs released a sanitized, safe version called Dance With Me, Henry. Gibbs' version sold millions of copies and dominated the mainstream charts, while Etta, the architect of the sound, saw almost none of the profit. This was Etta's first lesson in the predatory economics of the music industry. The voice that creates the fire is rarely the one that gets to stay warm by it. Etta's response to this theft was not to retreat, but to grow louder. She leaned into her rebellion, dyeing her hair a startling, unnatural platinum blonde, a forensic signal of her refusal to blend in or play the role of the good girl. This image was a shield. She began touring the Chitlin Circuit, the network of black-owned venues across the segregated South. The forensics of these tours were brutal. She traveled in cramped cars, slept in segregated boarding houses, and performed in dance halls where the humidity and the tension were equally thick. One night, the investigation records a moment of pure, reckless courage. After accidentally using a white-only restroom at a gas station, a group of armed men confronted Etta and her bandmate, Johnny Guitar Watson. A gun was leveled at Watson, and the men demanded that Etta apologize for her transgression. Etta, fueled by a lifetime of being told her place, refused to speak the word. She stood her ground in the face of lethal violence, a 14-year-old girl staring down the barrel of American racism. She never said sorry. This defiance became her signature. She wasn't just singing the blues, she was living them as an act of war. During these years, she found kinship in other rising stars who shared her scars: Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, and Ray Charles. But her true forensic idols were Billie Holiday and Dinah Washington, women who sang from their bruises. When Etta finally met Billie Holiday, the older singer offered a chilling warning: "Don't end up like me." But Etta was already walking that same jagged road. By the late 1,950 seconds, she had outgrown the novelty of teenage R&B. Her voice was deepening, becoming richer and more dangerous. She eventually landed at the doors of Chess Records in Chicago, the home of Muddy Waters and the High Temple of the Blues. Leonard Chess, the label's aggressive patriarch, saw Etta as his queen. He didn't want another girl group singer. He wanted a powerhouse who could cross over into the lush, orchestral world of pop while keeping the dirt of the Delta in her throat. The forensics of the Chess years were about to begin a period of unparalleled creative brilliance that would give the world At Last, but would also see Etta James enter a slow dance with the devil that would nearly cost her her life. When Etta James arrived at Chess Records in Chicago in 1960, she was no longer the teenage Wallflower from the West Coast. She was a woman whose vocal anatomy had matured into something volcanic. Leonard Chess, the legendary and often ruthless head of the label, recognized a forensic opportunity. At the time, Chess was the laboratory for the raw, electric blues of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. But Leonard wanted to penetrate the lucrative, Great American Songbook market. He saw in Etta a singer who could bridge the gap between the gutter and the ballroom. The forensics of the Chess sound involved a radical shift in production. Leonard surrounded Etta's raw, gospel-drenched voice with lush orchestral arrangements, violins, cellos, and elegant brass sections. The goal was to create a gilded cage for her voice. The investigation into this era highlights a fascinating irony. Etta was being dressed up in musical silk and pearls, yet her delivery remained unapologetically gritty. She wasn't just singing the melodies, she was interrogating them. In 1961, this experiment produced its most enduring result, At Last. Originally a 1,941 swing hit for Glenn Miller, the song was completely reimagined through Etta's forensic lens. When she sang that opening phrase, she didn't just perform a lyric, she claimed a victory. The song became a national anthem of redemption, a declaration that after a lifetime of invisibility and trauma, the dream had finally arrived. At Last would eventually follow Etta to her grave, becoming the most requested wedding song in American history, a forensic proof of her ability to translate her private pain into a universal language of hope. But behind the orchestral swells, the forensics of Etta's personal life were fracturing. She was rich in fame, but the investigation into the accounting at Chess Records reveals a darker structural reality. Etta was living on an advance system, a predatory financial model where the label paid for her cars, her furs, and her lifestyle, only to deduct those costs from her royalties at astronomical rates. One year, after a string of hits, Etta opened a royalty envelope expecting a fortune, only to find a bill for $14,000. She was a superstar who owned nothing, trapped in a cycle of debt to the man who made her a star. This financial and emotional instability led Etta toward a new kind of sanctuary. She began a slow dance with the devil, her own term for her descent into heroin addiction. The forensics of her entry into drug use are tragically common for the era. Seeking an escape from the pressure of the road and the pain of a high-profile breakup with musician Harvey Fuqua, Etta turned to the needle. She believed it was cocaine at first, but once the heroin hit her system, she felt a profound, chemical silence. For the first time in her life, the ghosts of her father and the scars of her childhood went quiet. Her life became a forensic study in duality. On stage, she was the epitome of elegance, draped in sequins and singing "Trust in Me" to adoring crowds. Offstage, she was a frantic hunter, scouring the streets of every tour stop for her next fix. She began showing up late to sessions, stumbling through performances, and forging checks to fund a habit that was costing her hundreds of dollars a day. The investigation shows that she even began injecting in her feet and her neck to hide the track marks from the prying eyes of the public and the police. Despite the chaos, her voice remained a forensic miracle. Even when her body was trembling from withdrawal, her vocal cords seemed to exist in a separate, untouched dimension. In 1962, she recorded "All I Could Do Was Cry." The forensics of that session are harrowing. Etta was reliving the real-world heartbreak of watching Harvey Fuqua marry another woman. She sang it through a haze of addiction and grief, producing a track so raw that it felt less like a recording and more like an open-heart surgery performed in public. By the mid-1960 seconds, the Gilded Cage was starting to rust. Etta was arrested for drug possession and check forgery, landing her in a cycle of jail cells and failed rehab attempts. She was a woman who had conquered the world's heart but could not control her own pulse. The era of elegance was fading, and a new, more aggressive sound was rising from the South. Etta James, the queen who had seen it all, was about to head to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to record the most honest music of her life, but the road there would be paved with needles and the ghosts of friends she lost along the way. The mid-1960 seconds represented a forensic paradox for Etta James. To the outside world, she was the sophisticated voice of Chess Records, a woman who had mastered the art of the orchestral ballad. But the internal data tells a story of systematic disintegration. Her addiction to heroin had shifted from a slow dance to a high-velocity collision with reality. She was no longer just using to escape, she was using to function. The investigation into this period reveals a woman who had become a ghost in her own career, her life dictated by the white powder that had claimed the street corners of Chicago. The forensics of her addiction were physically devastating. Etta began to suffer from the long-term effects of intravenous drug use, including a near-fatal bout with lockjaw tetanus caused by a contaminated needle. The doctors at the time called her survival a miracle, but for Etta, it felt like a sentence. She was trapped in a body that was breaking down, yet she was forced to maintain the image of the queen. She began to inject in her neck and under her tongue, seeking any available vein that hadn't yet collapsed. This wasn't just a search for a high. It was a forensic struggle to keep the darkness at bay. In 1964, the psychological structure of Etta's world suffered a catastrophic blow with the death of Sam Cooke. Sam had been more than a peer. He was a forensic link to her past, one of the few people who understood the transition from the church to the charts. When he was shot and killed at a Los Angeles motel under mysterious circumstances, Etta was shattered. The investigation into her reaction shows a woman spiraling into a deeper state of paranoia. She famously claimed that when she saw Sam's body at the funeral, his face appeared mangled, suggesting a level of violence that the official reports didn't fully acknowledge. To Etta, Sam's death was a forensic signal that no matter how much soul you gave the world could still discard you in the dirt. As the 1,960 seconds progressed, the musical landscape underwent a structural shift that threatened to render Etta obsolete. The Motown sound out of Detroit was becoming the new standard, polished, choreographed, and designed for mainstream pop consumption. Etta's raw, blues-heavy delivery began to feel like a relic of a previous era. The forensics of her record sales during this time show a jagged decline. She was the Queen of Soul before the title was officially handed to Aretha Franklin, and watching the throne pass to a younger, cleaner version of herself added a layer of professional resentment to her personal agony. By 1966, Etta was living in a state of functional homelessness, moving between cheap hotels and the homes of friends, her royalty checks signed over to dealers before they even touched her hands. She was arrested multiple times for forging prescriptions and check fraud. The forensics of her court appearances show a woman who was defiant but depleted. At one point, she was sent to a psychiatric ward, where the state attempted to cure her through a series of forced detoxes. But the investigation shows that the hunger in her soul was something that no state-mandated program could reach. However, even in the depths of her addiction, the unbreakable voice remained a forensic anomaly. In 1967, Leonard Chess sent her to Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, in a desperate attempt to revitalize her career. He wanted to strip away the violins and return to the dirt. What followed was a recording session that would define the second half of her life. Amidst a haze of withdrawal and the oppressive heat of the South, Etta stood in front of a microphone and recorded "Tell Mama and I'd Rather Go Blind." The forensics of "I'd Rather Go Blind" are unparalleled. It is a song of total surrender, a vocal performance that feels like it was dragged across broken glass. It was the sound of a woman who had lost everything: her friends, her money, her dignity, and had nothing left to offer but the truth. The session proved that while the white powder had taken her body, the fire was still there, burning beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to turn her despair into a hymn that the whole world would eventually hum. The descent was over. The raw, painful resurrection was about to begin. In the forensics of music production, there are certain geographic locations that act as spiritual conduits. Muscle Shoals, Alabama, was one of those places. In 1967, Leonard Chess made a strategic, forensic decision to transport Etta James from the urban polish of Chicago to the swampy, grit-laden atmosphere of Fame Studios. He knew that Etta's life was in freefall, and he gambled that the only way to save the artist was to strip away the artifice. He wanted to remove the orchestral Gilded Cage and place her in a room with a group of white Southern musicians who played with a deep, funky pocket that mirrored the dirt of the Delta. The sessions at Muscle Shoals were a forensic study in tension and truth. Etta arrived in Alabama thin, trembling from the early stages of withdrawal and profoundly suspicious of the environment. But when she stepped into the booth to record "I'd Rather Go Blind," something metaphysical occurred. The forensics of that track are unparalleled in the history of soul. Co-written by Etta and her friend Ellington "Fuzz" Jordan while he was in prison, the song was a raw nerve set to music. Etta's delivery was a masterclass in controlled agony. She wasn't just singing about a breakup, she was singing about the terror of being left alone in the dark. The investigation into "I'd Rather Go Blind" reveals that it was recorded in just a few takes. The musicians in the room recalled a palpable shift in the air, the sound of a woman whose soul was being scraped raw in public. It became her second signature, a forensic document of heartbreak that eclipsed "At Last" in its emotional depth. On the same trip, she recorded "Tell Mama," an upbeat, brass-heavy anthem that proved she could still command a groove with the authority of a general. The Muscle Shoals sessions didn't just revitalize her career, they proved that Etta's voice was a forensic anomaly that could survive even when her body was failing. However, the raw resurrection of her music did not immediately translate to the resurrection of her health. The 1,970 seconds were a forensic decade of relapse and recovery. Etta spent much of the decade in a cycle of court-ordered rehabilitation and brief periods of sobriety. In 1973, she was sent to the Tarzana Psychiatric Hospital for a 17-month stay. This was a turning point. The investigation into her records at Tarzana shows a woman who finally began to confront the ghost of her father and the childhood trauma that had fueled her addiction for 20 years. During this period, she met Artis, a man who would become her forensic anchor. Artis was a veteran of the same streets and the same struggles, but he offered Etta a type of loyalty she had never experienced. He eventually went to prison on her behalf, taking the fall for a drug charge to keep her out of jail and on the path to recovery. This sacrifice was a profound structural shift for Etta. For the first time in her life, a man had protected her instead of exploiting her. The forensics of her recovery were not a straight line, but a jagged, upward climb. She began to perform again, not for the charts, but for the sake of her own breath. She toured the world, finding that a new generation of listeners was discovering her Muscle Shoals recordings. In Paris, London, and Berlin, she was treated not as a relic, but as a living goddess of the blues. The investigation into her live performances in the late 70 seconds shows a voice that was changing the high. Crystal notes of her youth were yielding to a heavier, more resonant, whiskey tone. She was becoming a survivor in the truest sense. She had outlived Janis Joplin, who had worshipped her. She had outlived the Motown era that had briefly overshadowed her. She was standing tall beside legends like B. King, proving that soul was not a trend, but a state of being. By the time the 1,980 seconds arrived, Etta James was clean, focused, and ready to claim the accolades the world had denied her for 40 years. She had turned her despair into fire, and the smoke was finally clearing. The little girl from the church choir was gone. The matriarch of the blues was about to take her final bow. The final 2 decades of the 20th century witnessed a forensic shift in how the world perceived Etta James. She was no longer a tragic figure of the R&B circuit. She had ascended to the status of a living institution. By the 1,980 seconds, the fire that had once threatened to consume her had settled into a steady, controlled burn. The investigation into her career during this period reveals a woman who had finally achieved forensic mastery over her narrative. She was clean, her health was stabilizing, and the industry which had spent decades profiting from her struggle was finally ready to offer her a seat at the high table. The forensics of her voice during this era show a fascinating evolution. The high-frequency bell-like clarity of "At Last" had been replaced by a mature whiskey voice. It was deeper, heavier, and textured with the microscopic scars of a life lived in the extremes. In 1994, she released Mystery Lady, Songs of Billie Holiday. The forensics of this album are a circle closing. Etta was finally paying tribute to the woman who had warned her 30 years prior about the dangers of the road. The album was a masterpiece of restraint and emotional depth, earning Etta her first-ever Grammy Award for Best Jazz Vocal Performance. It took 40 years, but the girl who had been struck in the chest to project her voice was finally holding a golden trophy. In 1993, she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The forensics of that induction were symbolic. She was being recognized not just as a singer, but as a primary architect of rock and roll's soul. She stood on that stage, platinum hair still gleaming, a forensic proof of endurance. But even as the accolades poured in, Etta remained a woman of the dirt. She famously preferred performing in small, smoky blues clubs to the antiseptic atmosphere of grand concert halls. She understood that her music required a specific kind of forensic humidity, a connection to the audience that only exists when you can see the whites of their eyes and smell the whiskey on their breath. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw a structural rebirth of soul music, led by a new generation of artists who looked to Etta as their spiritual mother. The forensics of the soul revival are traceable directly to the grooves of Etta's 1960 records. Artists like Adele, Amy Winehouse, and Joss Stone began to cite Etta as their primary influence. They weren't just imitating her notes. They were attempting to replicate her forensic honesty, the ability to sing about heartbreak without a filter. When Adele spoke about hearing Etta James for the first time, she described it as a physical awakening. The Jamesetta Frequency was now part of the global pop DNA. This cultural canonization reached a climax in 2008 with the release of the film Cadillac Records. Beyonce Knowles Carter was cast to portray Etta during the chess years. The forensics of this casting were significant. It was the world's most polished superstar attempting to channel the world's most unpolished icon. Etta's reaction to the portrayal was a study in forensic duality. She was proud of the recognition, yet she maintained a protective distance from the Hollywood version of her pain. She famously quipped, "That girl did me justice," but she also reminded the public that while Beyonce was acting, Etta had been bleeding. However, as the 2000s progressed, the forensics of her health began to deteriorate. She continued to perform, often sitting in a chair, her voice sometimes trembling but never losing its authority. Even in her 70s, she could still deliver a growl that would silence a room. She was suffering from the long-term systemic impact of her past addiction, coupled with the onset of leukemia and dementia. The investigation into her final tours shows a woman who was literally being kept alive by the music. On stage, the fog of memory loss would often clear, and she would navigate the complex lyrics of "I'd Rather Go Blind" with forensic precision. The music was the only place where she was still whole. She had outlived the Peaches, she had outlived Leonard Chess, and she had outlived the heroin. She was the last woman standing in a world of ghosts, preparing for her final slow dance, not with the devil this time, but with peace. The final act of Etta James' life was a forensic study in the fragility of the human vessel versus the immortality of the human spirit. By 2010, the woman who had survived heroin, prison, and the predatory economics of the music industry faced an enemy that could not be outsung: the slow, systematic theft of memory. Diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and leukemia, the matriarch of the blues began her final retreat. The forensics of her final months are deeply moving. She spent her days in her riverside home, a space filled with the gold records and trophies that documented her war with the world, yet she often struggled to recognize the very songs that had defined her. However, the investigation into her final days reveals a metaphysical truth about the soul. While the cognitive functions of her brain began to fail, her musical instincts remained structurally intact. Her son, Danto, noted that even when she could no longer hold a conversation, her foot would still tap in perfect time to a blues rhythm. If someone played the first few bars of "At Last," her eyes would sharpen with a forensic clarity that bypassed the fog of dementia. The music was not stored in her memory. It was woven into her nervous system. Her husband, Artis Mills, remained the guardian of her dignity. Their 40-year marriage was a forensic proof of endurance, a rare constant in a life characterized by tectonic shifts. He fought the legal and medical systems to keep her at home, ensuring that the Queen would not spend her final hours in a sterile institution. On the 20th of January 2012, just 5 days before her 74th birthday, Etta James took her final breath. The cause was complications from leukemia, but the forensic reality was that the fire had simply finished its work. The response to her death was not one of mourning, but of canonization. In Los Angeles, the city that had once ignored a fatherless girl from Watts, fans gathered at her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The forensics of her legacy are visible in the sheer scale of her influence. From the inauguration of a president to the debut albums of 21st century icons, her voice remained the gold standard for emotional honesty. She had achieved the impossible. She had turned a slow dance with the devil into a hymn for humanity. Etta James didn't just sing the blues, she lived them until they turned into grace. She was a woman who was broken by the world and yet remained entirely whole in her art. The forensics of her life offer a final, powerful lesson, that survival itself is a form of creative expression. She showed every wounded child and every struggling woman that you can take the bruises of your life and turn them into a symphony. The little girl who was once forced to sing for strangers in the middle of the night finally found the silence she deserved. The song is over, but the echo is eternal. At last, Etta. At last, peace.